Genesis chapter 19 verse 1. And there came 2 angels to Sodom at even, and Lot sat in the gate of Sodom, and Lot seeing them rose up to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. Context and background. Genesis chapter 19 is a chapter that describes the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah due to their extreme wickedness. In the previous chapter, Genesis chapter 18, Abraham had an encounter with 3 men, one of whom was the Lord himself, who informed him of the impending judgment on these cities. Abraham interceded for the righteous in Sodom, particularly his nephew Lot and his family. The arrival of the angels. In Genesis chapter 19 verse 1, we see that 2 angels arrived in Sodom in the evening. The narrative mentions that Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. In ancient times, the gate of a city was a significant location where important matters were addressed, legal decisions were made, and business transactions occurred. Lot's presence at the gate suggests that he held a position of authority or influence in the city. Lot's response. When Lot saw the angels, he immediately rose up to meet them and bowed himself with his face toward the ground. Lot's response indicates his recognition of their divine nature and his reverence toward them. It shows his hospitality and respect, which was a common custom in the ancient Near East. Lot's actions demonstrate his desire to honor and welcome these visitors. Lessons from Genesis chapter 19 verse 1. Hospitality. Lot's response teaches us the importance of showing hospitality to others, especially to strangers. Hebrews chapter 13 verse 2 reminds us, "Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it." Lot's act of hospitality played a significant role in the events that followed. Reverence and worship. Lot's bowing down and showing reverence toward the angels reminds us of the importance of reverencing God and worshiping Him. Lot's actions reflect an attitude of humility, recognizing the presence and authority of God's messengers. Faithfulness in a corrupt environment. Lot's position at the gate of Sodom suggests that he was living amidst a morally corrupt society. However, he remained faithful to God and maintained his integrity. This challenges us to remain steadfast in our faith and righteousness, even when surrounded by ungodliness. Divine encounters. The arrival of the angels and their interaction with Lot remind us that God sometimes sends divine messengers or encounters into our lives. These encounters may present opportunities for us to align ourselves with God's purposes, receive His guidance, or experience His intervention. Therefore, it is important for us to be sensitive to God's leading and respond with reverence and obedience. Remember that this study provides an overview of Genesis chapter 19 verse 1. To gain a deeper understanding, it's beneficial to read the entire chapter and explore further insights and applications from the passage. Genesis chapter 19 verse 2. And he said, "Behold now, my lords, turn in, I pray you, into your servant's house, and tarry all night, and wash your feet, and ye shall rise up early, and go on your ways." And they said, "Nay, but we will abide in the street all night." This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis that describes the events surrounding the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Prior to this verse, 2 angels had arrived in the city of Sodom in the form of men, and Lot, Abraham's nephew, had encountered him at the city gate. Lot recognized their divine nature and extended hospitality by inviting them into his house. Hospitality and the duty of protection. Genesis chapter 19 verse 2 highlights the virtue of hospitality. Lot, recognizing the stranger's need for shelter and protection, invites them into his house. In biblical times, hospitality was highly valued and considered a moral duty. Lot's willingness to protect and provide for the strangers reflects his righteousness and compassionate nature. This verse serves as a reminder to Christians about the importance of showing kindness and hospitality to others, especially to those in need. Lot's awareness of the dangers. Lot's invitation to the angels to come into his house rather than staying in the street shows his awareness of the dangers present in the city of Sodom. The streets of Sodom were likely unsafe, and Lot understood the risks the strangers would face if left outside. As believers, This verse can remind us to be discerning and cautious about the environments we find ourselves in and to seek the safety and protection of God's presence. The angel's refusal. Interestingly, despite Lot's invitation, the angels refused his offer to stay in his house and chose to remain in the street. This decision foreshadows the wickedness that existed within the city of Sodom and highlights the impending judgment that would befall it. The angels were aware of the evil and corruption within the city and had a specific purpose to fulfill. Symbolic significance. This verse also carries symbolic significance. Lot's house can be seen as a representation of refuge and safety, while the street symbolizes the sinful and dangerous world. Lot's offer to bring the angels into his house can be understood as an invitation to find protection and salvation in God's dwelling place. In contrast, the angel's decision to stay in the street signifies the separation between the righteous and the unrighteous, illustrating the impending destruction that would come upon the city of Sodom. Overall, Genesis chapter 19 verse 2 reminds us of the importance of hospitality, discernment, and the need to seek refuge and protection in God. It serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of wickedness and the impending judgment that can befall those who persist in sin. Genesis chapter 19 verse 3, "And he pressed upon him greatly, and they turned in unto him, and entered into his house, and he made him a feast, and did bake unleavened bread, and they did eat." This verse is part of the narrative describing the events surrounding the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. In this particular verse, the focus is on Lot, the nephew of Abraham, who encountered two angels that had come to warn him about the impending judgment on the cities. Let's delve into the context and explore the significance of this verse within the broader story. Hospitality of Lot. Lot, residing in the city of Sodom, demonstrated hospitality by inviting the two angels into his house. The prevailing custom in the ancient Near East placed great importance on hospitality towards strangers, and Lot's actions exemplified this virtue. Despite the wickedness of the city, Lot maintained his righteous character by extending hospitality and offering refuge to the visitors. Making a feast and baking unleavened bread, upon their arrival, Lot prepared a meal for his guests. He went to great lengths to ensure their comfort and well-being. The mention of baking unleavened bread suggests the haste with which this meal was prepared. Unleavened bread, devoid of yeast, requires less time to rise, indicating the urgency of the situation. Symbolic significance. The act of providing a meal holds symbolic meaning beyond mere sustenance. In biblical times, sharing a meal often signified a bond of trust and fellowship. By inviting the angels into his house and offering him a feast, Lot demonstrated his willingness to establish a relationship of trust with them. Foreshadowing events. This verse serves as a prelude to the dramatic events that follow in the narrative. The angels inform Lot of God's plan to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah due to their grievous sins. Lot's hospitality and protection of the angels from the wicked inhabitants of Sodom underscore his righteousness and highlight the contrast between him and the surrounding culture. Overall, Genesis chapter 19 verse 3 showcases Lot's hospitality and righteousness in the face of a corrupt society. It emphasizes the importance of extending kindness and compassion to strangers and the significance of building relationships grounded in trust and fellowship. Genesis chapter 19 verse 4. But before they lay down, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round, both old and young, all the people from every quarter. Genesis chapter 19 tells the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, two cities known for their wickedness. In this particular verse, we see the men of Sodom gathering around Lot's house with the intention of committing a sinful act. To understand the significance of Genesis chapter 19 verse 4, it is important to provide context. In the preceding verses, two angels had arrived in Sodom in the form of men. Lot, who was Abraham's nephew, welcomed them into his house and showed them hospitality. These angels were sent by God to rescue Lot and his family before the destruction of the city. When the men of Sodom learned about the presence of these visitors in Lot's house, they surrounded it. The phrase, "compassed the house round," indicates that they encircled the house from all sides. The text specifies that the men were from every quarter, emphasizing that it was not just a select few individuals but rather a representation of the entire community. The intention of the men of Sodom in surrounding Lot's house was to commit a grave sin. The subsequent verses make it clear that their desire was to engage in homosexual acts with the angels. This passage has often been cited as evidence of the wickedness and moral decay of Sodom. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah serves as a warning against the consequences of unrepentant sin and rebellion against God's law. Ultimately, both cities were destroyed by fire and brimstone as a divine judgment for their wickedness. Lot and his family were spared from the destruction because of God's mercy and the intercession of Abraham. It is important to note that interpretations of this passage and the sin of Sodom have been the subject of debate and discussion among scholars and theologians. While the story is commonly associated with homosexuality, it is crucial to approach the text with sensitivity and seek a comprehensive understanding by considering the cultural and historical context, as well as other scriptural references. Genesis chapter 19 verse 5. And they called unto Lot, and said unto him, Where are the men which came into thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them. Genesis chapter 19 tells the story of the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. In this particular verse, the men of Sodom surround Lot's house and demand that he bring out the two angels who had arrived in the city. Their intention is clear. They wanted to know the men, which is commonly understood to imply sexual relations. This passage raises several important points for discussion and interpretation. Sin and judgment. The context of Genesis chapter 19 reveals that the men of Sodom were deeply wicked and sinful. Their immoral desires and actions had reached such a point that God determined to destroy the cities. This story illustrates the severe consequences of unbridled wickedness and highlights God's judgment on sin. Homosexuality. The passage is often cited as a biblical reference to homosexual behavior. The men of Sodom's demand for sexual relations with the angels has been interpreted as evidence of the city's widespread practice of homosexuality. This verse, along with other biblical references such as Leviticus chapter 18 verse 22 and Leviticus chapter 20 verse 13, has been used in discussions about the Bible's stance on same-sex relationships. It is important to note that interpretations and discussions regarding homosexuality and the Bible vary among different individuals and religious traditions. Lot's response. Lot's response to the men of Sodom is found in the subsequent verses. He offers his daughters instead of the angels, which has been a subject of ethical debate. Some argue that Lot's decision was the result of cultural norms and the importance of hospitality in that time and context. Others view his offer as an act of desperation or as evidence of his compromised moral judgment due to his immersion in the wickedness of Sodom. Lessons for Christians. Christians often look to this story as a reminder of the consequences of immorality and the importance of resisting sinful behavior. It serves as a cautionary tale and emphasizes the need for believers to live according to God's commands and not be influenced by the immoral values of the world around them. It is important to approach the study of this verse and the larger story with sensitivity and an understanding of its historical and cultural context. Interpretations and theological perspectives may differ among individuals and religious traditions. Consulting different commentaries, studying related passages, and seeking guidance from trusted spiritual leaders can provide further insights when studying this and other biblical texts. Genesis chapter 19 verse 6. And Lot went out at the door unto them, and shut the door after him. Genesis chapter 19 verse 6, KJV. In this verse, Lot, who was the nephew of Abraham, had two visitors who were actually angels sent by God to rescue Lot and his family from the impending judgment upon the city of Sodom. Here are a few key points to consider when studying this verse. Hospitality. Lot's action of going out to meet his visitors at the door and shutting the door behind him demonstrates the cultural value of hospitality prevalent in that time. It was customary to offer protection and provision to guests who were staying with you. Lot displayed hospitality by going out to greet his visitors and ensure their safety by closing the door behind him. Separation from sin. Lot's decision to separate himself from the wickedness of the city is evident in this verse. As a righteous man, he was disturbed by the sinful behavior and immoral practices of the people of Sodom. Lot's willingness to leave the city and protect his guests shows his desire to distance himself from the corruption and evil that had consumed the city. Protection. Lot's actions can also be seen as an attempt to protect his guests from the wicked intentions of the men of Sodom. Shortly after this verse, the men of Sodom gather around Lot's house and demand that the visitors be brought out to them so they can engage in immoral acts with them. Lot's actions in going out and closing the door were aimed at preventing harm from coming to his guests. Foreshadowing. This verse foreshadows the impending destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot's actions of shutting the door behind him signify the closing off of the opportunity for the people of Sodom to turn away from their wickedness and escape God's judgment. It serves as a reminder that God's judgment is just and that there are consequences for persistent sin. This verse, within the larger context of Genesis chapter 19, highlights the themes of hospitality, separation from sin, and the impending judgment of God. It also reveals Lot's character as a righteous man in a corrupt environment. It is important to read the entire account of Genesis chapter 19 to gain a complete understanding of the events and the messages conveyed in this passage. Genesis chapter 19 verse 7, "And said, I pray you, brethren, do not so wickedly." This verse is part of the narrative of the account of the city of Sodom and its impending destruction. To understand the significance of Genesis chapter 19 verse 7, it is helpful to examine the broader context of the passage. In Genesis chapter 19, 2 angels, who appeared as men, came to the city of Sodom and were welcomed into the house of Lot, the nephew of Abraham. The men of the city, both young and old, surrounded Lot's house and demanded that the visitors be brought out so that they could engage in sexual acts with them. Lot, recognizing the wickedness of the city, went out to address the men and urged them not to commit such a wicked act. Lot's statement in Genesis chapter 19 verse 7 reflects his plea to the men of Sodom, referring to them as brethren. Although Lot used this term to address the men, it should not be taken to imply that he regarded their actions as acceptable or condoned their behavior. Rather, Lot's use of the term brethren was likely an attempt to appeal to their shared humanity and perhaps to remind them of the familial ties they had with one another. Lot's plea for them not to act wickedly is significant because it reveals his righteous character and his concern for the well-being of the visitors under his protection. Lot understood the gravity of the sin that the men of Sodom intended to commit and wanted to prevent them from engaging in such wickedness. This passage serves as a stark example of the depravity and moral corruption that had consumed the city of Sodom. It also highlights the contrast between Lot's righteousness and the wickedness of the people around him. Ultimately, the city of Sodom was destroyed by God because of its widespread wickedness and lack of repentance. Genesis chapter 19 verse 7, in its broader context, serves as a reminder of the importance of righteousness and the consequences of living in a society characterized by immorality. It also emphasizes the significance of standing up for what is right, even in the face of opposition and societal pressure. In studying this verse, it is crucial to interpret it in light of the overall message and themes of the Bible, such as the importance of moral integrity, the consequences of sin, and the call to live in accordance with God's principles of righteousness. Genesis chapter 19 verse 8. Behold now, I have 2 daughters which have not known man. Let me, I pray you, bring them out unto you, and do ye to them as is good in your eyes. Only unto these men do nothing, for therefore came they under the shadow of my roof. This verse is part of the narrative of the account of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Let's delve into the context and explore the meaning of this verse in its biblical context. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah begins in Genesis chapter 18 when 3 visitors, who are later revealed to be angels, visit Abraham and tell him about the impending judgment upon the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah due to their great wickedness. Abraham pleads with God for the righteous people in the cities, and God agrees to spare the cities if even 10 righteous people are found within them. In Genesis chapter 19, the two angels arrive in Sodom and are welcomed by Lot, Abraham's nephew, who resides in the city. The men of the city, however, surround Lot's house and demand that the visitors be brought out to them so that they may engage in sexual acts with them. Lot, being aware of the wickedness of the men, offers his two daughters to the crowd in an attempt to protect the angels. It is crucial to understand the cultural context of hospitality in ancient Near Eastern culture. In that time, hospitality was highly valued, and it was considered a grave offense to mistreat or harm guests who were under one's roof. Lot's offer to his daughters, although perplexing to us today, can be seen as an extreme act of protecting the sanctity of hospitality, even at great personal cost. Lot's actions in offering his daughters, however, should not be seen as morally justified or endorsed by the biblical narrative. The Bible often records the actions of its characters without explicitly approving of them. In this case, the text is providing an account of Lot's desperate attempt to protect the guests under his care. It is important to note that the Bible does not explicitly comment on Lot's offer, and the subsequent narrative does not portray it as a righteous or praiseworthy act. Rather, the account highlights the moral depravity of the men of Sodom and the dire consequences of their actions. As we examine this verse, we should remember that the Bible often depicts flawed characters who make mistakes and act in ways contrary to God's will. It is crucial to approach such passages with discernment and consider the broader biblical message of justice, love, and righteousness. Genesis chapter 19 verse 9. And they said, "Stand back." And they said again, "This one fellow came in to sojourn, and he will needs be a judge. Now will we deal worse with thee than with them." And they pressed sore upon the man, even Lot, and came near to break the door. Genesis chapter 19 recounts the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. In this particular verse, we find the men of Sodom surrounding Lot's house, demanding that Lot bring out the two angels who had come to visit him. The men of the city were intent on committing wicked acts with the visitors, highlighting the extreme moral degradation of Sodom. The context: prior to this event, the two angels, disguised as men, had arrived in Sodom and were welcomed into Lot's home. The inhabitants of the city, both young and old, surrounded Lot's house and demanded to have sexual relations with the angels. This demonstrates the widespread wickedness and depravity of the people of Sodom. Lot's response: in response to the mob, Lot stepped outside and closed the door behind him, pleading with the men not to act wickedly. He offered an alternative to their wicked desires by offering his two virgin daughters instead, though this action itself raises ethical questions. It is important to note that Lot's decision may have been influenced by the cultural norms and expectations of hospitality prevalent at that time. The men's response: the men of Sodom rejected Lot's offer and accused him of trying to assume the role of a judge over them. They accused Lot, an outsider, of interfering in their affairs and presumed that he was imposing his own sense of judgment upon them. They threatened to deal even worse with Lot than with the angels, showing their hostility towards him. Lot's peril: the situation escalated as the men pressed upon Lot and came near to break the door of his house. Their aggression and determination to carry out their wicked intentions intensified. The narrative highlights the imminent danger that Lot faced due to his attempt to protect the visitors. Genesis chapter 19 verse 9 serves as a reminder of the severe moral decay and disregard for righteousness that characterized the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. It also illustrates the courage of Lot, who was willing to protect his guests even at great personal risk. However, it is important to approach this passage with sensitivity and discernment, considering the cultural context of the time and acknowledging the ethical concerns regarding Lot's offer of his daughters. Genesis chapter 19 verse 10. But the men put forth their hand, and pulled Lot into the house to them, and shut to the door. This verse is part of the account of the events that took place in the city of Sodom just before its destruction. To understand the significance of this verse, it is helpful to provide some context. In Genesis chapter 19, two angels arrived in the city of Sodom in the form of men. Lot, who was the nephew of Abraham, lived in Sodom with his family. When Lot saw the angels, he greeted them and offered them hospitality, inviting them to stay at his house for the night. However, the men of the city, who were known for their wickedness, surrounded Lot's house and demanded that he bring out the two men, angels, so that they could have sexual relations with them. This was a wicked and immoral act, indicative of the extreme corruption that had consumed the city. In the midst of this dangerous situation, we come to Genesis chapter 19 verse 10, where it says, "But the men put forth their hand, and pulled Lot into the house to them, and shut to the door." Here, the men referred to are the two angels who had come to visit Lot. This verse reveals the urgency and seriousness of the situation. The angels recognized the imminent danger that Lot and his family were facing from the wicked men of the city. In an act of divine intervention, they reached out their hands, physically pulled Lot back into the safety of the house, and quickly shut the door behind him. This action demonstrated the divine protection and deliverance of Lot and his family from the imminent judgment that was about to befall the city. The angels acted as agents of God's mercy and grace, rescuing Lot and ensuring his safety. The events of Genesis chapter 19 verse 10 highlight several important themes. Divine intervention. The actions of the angels reflect God's intervention in human affairs. It underscores God's concern for the righteous and his willingness to rescue them from harm. God's judgment. The wickedness of Sodom had reached a point where divine judgment was inevitable. The imminent destruction of the city serves as a reminder of God's justice and the consequences of sin. God's protection of the righteous. Lot, although not without his own flaws, was deemed righteous in God's eyes, 2 Peter chapter 2 verses 7 through 8. God's intervention demonstrates his care for those who seek to live righteously amidst a corrupt and sinful environment. The power of God's messengers. The angels displayed their authority and power by physically pulling Lot into the house and shutting the door. Their actions emphasized the supernatural nature of their presence and their role as agents of God's will. In summary, Genesis chapter 19 verse 10 captures a crucial moment in the account of Lot's rescue from Sodom. It showcases God's intervention, the impending judgment on Sodom, and the divine protection extended to the righteous. It serves as a reminder of God's justice, his care for the righteous, and the power of his messengers in executing his will. Genesis chapter 19 verse 11. "And they smote the men that were at the door of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they wearied themselves to find the door." Genesis chapter 19 verse 11 is part of the account of the events that occurred in the city of Sodom just before its destruction. The two angels who had come to rescue Lot and his family from the impending judgment of God were staying at his house. The wicked men of the city surrounded Lot's house, demanding that the angels be brought out to them so that they could have sexual relations with them. In this verse, we see the response of the angels to the wicked intentions of the men. The angels struck the men outside the door with blindness. This supernatural blindness affected both the young and the old, causing confusion and making it difficult for them to find the entrance to Lot's house. The men became exhausted as they blindly searched for the door, unable to carry out their wicked plan. This event demonstrates God's judgment upon the depravity and wickedness of the people of Sodom. It also shows the power and authority of God's angels to execute his will. The blindness inflicted upon the men served as a form of divine intervention, protecting Lot and his family from the immoral intentions of the wicked crowd. Genesis chapter 19 verse 11 teaches us several important lessons. God's judgment on sin. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah serves as a reminder that God is just and cannot tolerate unrepentant sin. The actions of the men of Sodom had reached a point where God's righteous judgment was necessary. Divine protection. In the midst of judgment, God provides protection for those who are faithful to him. Lot, being a righteous man, found refuge in his home and received the assistance of God's angels. This demonstrates that God is able to shield his people from harm even in the most dire circumstances. The power of God's messengers. The angels exhibited supernatural power by inflicting blindness upon the men. This reminds us that God's angels are not only messengers but also agents of his will, capable of executing his divine plans and intervening in human affairs. The consequences of wickedness, the blindness inflicted upon the men, showcases the consequences of their sinful desires. Their pursuit of immoral acts led them to a state of confusion and futility, highlighting the self-destructive nature of sin. In summary, Genesis chapter 19 verse 11 reveals God's judgment upon the wicked men of Sodom through the blindness inflicted by the angels. It underscores the importance of righteousness, God's protection, and the consequences of unrepentant sin. This verse serves as a reminder of God's justice and His ability to intervene in human affairs for the sake of His faithful servants. Genesis chapter 19 verse 12. And the men said unto Lot, Hast thou here any besides, son-in-law, and thy sons, and thy daughters, and whatsoever thou hast in the city, bring him out of this place. In this verse, we find the context of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot, the nephew of Abraham, had settled in the city of Sodom with his family. Two angels, disguised as men, had come to visit Lot and warn him of the impending destruction of the city by God. The visitation of the angels. The verse begins with the men, who were actually angels, speaking to Lot. This visitation of angels was a divine intervention and a demonstration of God's mercy towards Lot and his family. It highlights God's desire to rescue them before the judgment falls upon Sodom. God's concern for the righteous. The men asked Lot if he had any other family members in the city whom he should bring out. They specifically mentioned his sons, daughters, and sons-in-law. This reveals God's concern for the righteous and His willingness to spare them from the coming judgment. The urgency to leave. The men instructed Lot to bring out all his family members and possessions from the city. The urgency in their command indicates the imminent destruction about to befall Sodom. This emphasizes the need for Lot and his family to quickly escape the city to avoid the consequences of God's judgment. The lesson of obedience. This verse also serves as a lesson on obedience to God's instructions. Lot was instructed to bring out all his family members, leaving no one behind. This suggests that partial obedience would not have been acceptable. It teaches us the importance of heeding God's commands completely and without delay. Genesis chapter 19 verse 12 highlights God's mercy, concern for the righteous, the urgency of judgment, and the importance of obedience. It reminds us of God's desire to rescue His people and His call for them to follow Him wholeheartedly. Genesis chapter 19 verse 13. For we will destroy this place because the cry of them is waxen great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord hath sent us to destroy it. This verse is a part of the account of the events surrounding the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Prior to this verse, two angels, disguised as men, arrived in Sodom and were hosted by Lot, the nephew of Abraham. The men of the city, both young and old, surrounded Lot's house and demanded that the visitors be brought out to them so that they could have sexual relations with them. The situation had reached a point of great wickedness and depravity in the eyes of the Lord. In Genesis chapter 19 verse 13, the angels who were sent to rescue Lot and his family make a declaration to Lot, explaining their mission and the reason for the destruction of the cities. The angels reveal that they were sent by the Lord to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because of the outcry against their wickedness that had reached the Lord's attention. This verse provides important insights into the character of God and His response to sin. It reveals that God is aware of the evil committed by people and that He takes it seriously. The cry mentioned here refers to the outcry of the victims of the city's wickedness, expressing their suffering and the injustice they experienced. It is worth noting that the wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah went beyond the sin of attempted homosexual rape. The cities were characterized by a multitude of sins, including arrogance, inhospitality, greed, and disregard for the poor and needy. The outcry of these sins reached God, and He determined to bring judgment upon the cities. This verse serves as a reminder of God's justice and His intolerance of sin. It shows that God is not indifferent to the suffering caused by human wickedness and that He will ultimately hold people accountable for their actions. It also highlights the importance of righteousness and the consequences of turning away from God's ways. Overall, Genesis chapter 19 verse 13 underscores the importance of living a life that is pleasing to God and serves as a reminder that God's justice will ultimately prevail. Genesis chapter 19 verse 14. And Lot went out, and spake unto his sons-in-law, which married his daughters, and said, Up, get you out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city. But he seemed as one that mocked unto his sons-in-law. Context: in Genesis chapter 19, we find the account of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. These cities were notorious for their wickedness and had become exceedingly sinful. God determined to destroy them, but he planned to spare Lot and his family. Lot's sons-in-law. Lot had married his daughters off to men from the city of Sodom. When he received the warning from God's angels about the imminent destruction, Lot went to his sons-in-law to warn them. However, they perceived his warning as a joke or mockery and did not take it seriously. Lot's concern for his sons-in-law's salvation is evident in his attempt to warn them. He recognized the severity of the situation and the impending judgment of God upon the city. His desire was to save his family from the destruction that was about to come. Mockery and unbelief. The response of Lot's sons-in-law reflects their disbelief and their hardened hearts. Despite receiving a warning from Lot, they did not believe him or take his words seriously. Their lack of faith in God and his judgment resulted in their tragic demise when the city was destroyed. Lessons for us. Genesis chapter 19 verse 14 reminds us of the importance of heeding God's warnings and taking them seriously. It highlights the consequences of disbelief and the danger of mocking God's message. It also emphasizes the responsibility we have to share God's truth and warnings with others, even if they may not immediately accept or understand them. God's mercy. Although Lot's sons-in-law did not respond to the warning, God's mercy was extended to Lot and his immediate family. The angels urged Lot to take his family and flee the city before its destruction. This displays God's willingness to spare the righteous and his desire for people to turn away from sin and find salvation. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 19 verse 14 teaches us about the importance of heeding God's warnings, the consequences of disbelief, and the responsibility we have to share God's truth with others. It also reminds us of God's mercy and his desire to save those who turn to him. Genesis chapter 19 verse 15. And when the morning arose, then the angels hastened Lot, saying, Arise, take thy wife, and thy 2 daughters, which are here, lest thou be consumed in the iniquity of the city. Genesis chapter 19 verse 15 recounts the events that occurred just before the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. This passage highlights the urgency and gravity of the situation, as well as the divine intervention that took place in order to rescue Lot and his family. The morning arises. The verse begins by stating, and when the morning arose. This suggests that the previous events, including the visitation of the angels to Lot and their encounter with the wicked men of the city, took place during the night. The angels command. The angels hastened Lot, urging him to take his wife and 2 daughters and leave the city. Their urgency emphasizes the imminent danger that awaited Sodom and Gomorrah. The angels were sent by God to deliver Lot and his family from the impending destruction. The reason for escape. The angels warned Lot, lest thou be consumed in the iniquity of the city. This implies that the imminent destruction was not only a result of the wickedness of the city but also a consequence of the divine judgment that was about to be unleashed upon it. Lot and his family were instructed to flee to avoid being caught up in the punishment of the wicked. This verse reveals the mercy and grace of God as he sends his angels to rescue Lot and his family from the impending destruction. It also serves as a reminder of the consequences of living in a society marked by widespread wickedness and unrepentant sin. The story of Lot and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 19 highlights the importance of righteousness and obedience to God. It serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of immorality and the need to heed God's warnings. Additionally, it emphasizes God's faithfulness to deliver his people from harm when they trust and obey him. Overall, Genesis chapter 19 verse 15 teaches us about God's mercy, His judgment against sin, and the importance of heeding His warnings. Genesis chapter 19 verse 16. And while he lingered, the men laid hold upon his hand, and upon the hand of his wife, and upon the hand of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful unto him, and they brought him forth, and set him without the city. This verse is part of the account of the events surrounding the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Prior to this verse, 2 angels had arrived in Sodom in the form of men, and Lot, the nephew of Abraham, welcomed them into his home and offered them hospitality. However, the men of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded Lot's house and demanded that the visitors be brought out to them so that they could have sexual relations with them. Lot, recognizing the wickedness of the men, went outside and tried to reason with them, even offering his own daughters instead. This action, though troubling to modern readers, can be understood as Lot's desperate attempt to protect the angels under his care. In the midst of this tense situation, the angels seized Lot, his wife, and his 2 daughters, taking hold of their hands. The phrase, "while he lingered," indicates that Lot hesitated, perhaps not fully comprehending the gravity of the impending judgment. The angels, in their mercy, forcibly brought them out of the city, leading them to safety. This verse reveals a couple of significant points. First, it highlights the angels' role as agents of God's mercy and deliverance. Despite the wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah, God showed compassion and extended mercy to Lot and his family by sending angels to rescue them from the impending destruction. Second, it serves as a reminder of the urgency to respond to God's warnings. Lot's lingering hesitation can be seen as a reflection of his attachment to the city and its sinful ways. His delay could have put his own life and the lives of his family members at risk. Similarly, it is essential for believers to heed God's warnings and promptly respond, without clinging to the things of this world that may lead to destruction. Genesis chapter 19 verse 16 showcases God's mercy and the urgency of responding to His guidance. It also serves as a cautionary reminder to prioritize our spiritual well-being over worldly attachments. Genesis chapter 19 verse 17. And it came to pass, when they had brought them forth abroad, that he said, Escape for thy life. Look not behind thee, neither stay thou in all the plain. Escape to the mountain, lest thou be consumed. This verse is part of the account of the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. To understand the context and significance of this verse, let's explore the broader passage. In Genesis chapter 19, 2 angels arrived in the city of Sodom, and Lot, who was Abraham's nephew, offered them hospitality and shelter in his home. However, the men of the city, both young and old, surrounded Lot's house and demanded that the visitors be brought out so they could have sexual relations with them. This wickedness and depravity were prevalent in Sodom, which had led to God's judgment upon the city. Recognizing the evil that surrounded him, Lot tried to protect his guests and offered his own daughters to the men of the city instead. However, the angels struck the men with blindness and urged Lot to gather his family and leave the city before its destruction. In Genesis chapter 19 verse 17, the verse you mentioned, one of the angels speaks to Lot, giving him instructions on how to escape the impending judgment. The angel tells Lot to escape for his life and not to look behind him or stay in the plain. The angel advises him to flee to the mountain to ensure his safety, warning him of the imminent destruction that would consume the city. The phrase, "Look not behind thee," is significant because it carries a warning against disobedience and lingering attachment to the sinful city. However, as the story unfolds, we see that Lot's wife disobeys the command and looks back, and she is turned into a pillar of salt. Genesis chapter 19 verse 26. This serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of disobedience and the importance of fully obeying God's instructions. This passage reveals several important lessons. The consequences of wickedness. The account of Sodom and Gomorrah emphasizes the gravity of sin and the judgment that can result from a society's moral decay. It highlights the destructive power of sin and serves as a warning to us to be vigilant against wickedness. God's mercy and deliverance. Even in the midst of judgment, God extends His mercy and provides an opportunity for Lot and his family to escape. It demonstrates God's compassion for the righteous and His willingness to rescue them from harm. The danger of attachment to worldly things. The instruction not to look back or linger in the plain represents the danger of clinging to worldly attachments and the temptation to return to a sinful lifestyle. It teaches us the importance of detaching ourselves from the sinful influences and pursuits of the world. The consequences of disobedience. Lot's wife's disobedience and her decision to look back resulted in her immediate judgment. This serves as a reminder of the importance of obedience to God's commands and the consequences that can follow when we choose to disobey. Overall, Genesis chapter 19 verse 17 highlights the urgency of heeding God's warnings, the importance of obeying His instructions, and the consequences that can arise from disobedience. It also reminds us of God's mercy and deliverance for those who seek righteousness. Genesis chapter 19 verse 18. And Lot said unto them, Oh, not so, my Lord. This verse is part of the narrative of the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot, the nephew of Abraham, had been living in Sodom with his family. Two angels, disguised as men, came to Sodom to warn Lot of the impending destruction. Lot, recognizing their divine nature, invited them to stay at his house for the night and provided them with hospitality. Earlier in the story, the men of the city of Sodom surrounded Lot's house, demanding that he send out the two men, angels, so that they could engage in sexual acts with them. Lot, seeking to protect his guests, offered his own daughters to the mob instead, which reveals the extreme wickedness of the city. However, the angels pulled Lot back into the house and struck the men outside with blindness. In Genesis chapter 19 verse 18, after the angels informed Lot that they were going to destroy the city, Lot pleads with them not to destroy the city and asks them to spare a small nearby town called Zoar. The King James Version translates Lot's plea as, Oh, not so, my Lord. This verse reflects Lot's concern for the fate of the city and his desire to protect his family and the people he knew. It shows Lot's intercession for the city, as he recognizes the impending judgment of God and seeks mercy. Lot's plea can be seen as an example of a righteous person interceding on behalf of others. Even though Lot himself was not without his own flaws and weaknesses, he demonstrated a measure of compassion and concern for the people of Sodom. However, it's important to note that God had already determined to destroy the city because of its extreme wickedness, as demonstrated by the men's intentions to commit grave sins. This passage serves as a reminder of the consequences of sin and the importance of righteousness. It also highlights the tension between God's justice and His mercy, as well as the significance of intercession and the potential impact of righteous individuals in pleading for the salvation of others. Overall, Genesis chapter 19 verse 18 provides a glimpse into the complex moral and spiritual dynamics surrounding the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and serves as a lesson about the consequences of wickedness and the importance of intercession and righteousness. Genesis chapter 19 verse 19. Behold now, thy servant hath found grace in thy sight, and thou hast magnified thy mercy, which thou hast showed unto me in saving my life, and I cannot escape to the mountain, lest some evil take me, and I die. Context: Genesis chapter 19 tells the account of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The two cities were exceedingly wicked, and God had decided to destroy them. However, because of Abraham's intercession, God sent two angels to rescue Lot and his family before executing judgment on the cities. The angels warned Lot and his family to flee from the impending destruction. Recognition of God's grace. In Genesis chapter 19 verse 19, Lot speaks to one of the angels who had warned him about the impending judgment. He acknowledges that he has found grace in God's sight. Despite the evil and wickedness surrounding him, Lot recognizes God's favor upon him. This verse demonstrates Lot's understanding that God's mercy had been extended to him and his family. Magnification of God's mercy. Lot further acknowledges that God had magnified his mercy by saving his life. Lot recognizes that he was deserving of judgment, but God's mercy intervened to rescue him. Lot acknowledges that it was an act of God's mercy that his life was spared. Fear and need for protection. Lot expresses his fear and explains why he cannot escape to the mountain as suggested by the angels. He is concerned that if he were to flee to the mountain, some evil might overtake him, and he could die. Lot acknowledges his vulnerability and the need for God's protection. Trusting God's guidance. Lot's response shows his trust in the angels' guidance and his willingness to follow their instructions. Although he expressed his concerns, he ultimately recognized the authority and wisdom of the messengers of God. Application. Reflect on your own life and identify moments where you have recognized God's grace and mercy. Consider the areas in your life where you need God's protection and guidance. Pray and seek His wisdom in those situations. Express gratitude to God for His grace and mercy. Consider ways to magnify His mercy in your interactions with others. Remember, studying the Bible is not just about gaining knowledge but also applying its teachings to our lives. May this study deepen your understanding of God's grace, mercy, and guidance, and may it inspire you to trust Him more fully in your journey of faith. Genesis chapter 19 verse 20. Behold now, this city is near to flee unto, and it is a little one. Oh, let me escape thither, is it not a little one, and my soul shall live. This verse is a part of the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. To understand the context of Genesis chapter 19 verse 20, we need to look at the preceding events. In Genesis chapter 18, 3 visitors, who are later revealed to be angels, appear to Abraham near the oaks of Mamre. They inform him of God's plan to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah due to the wickedness of their inhabitants. Abraham, concerned for his nephew Lot who lived in Sodom, intercedes on behalf of the righteous people in the city. He asks if God would spare the city if 50 righteous people were found there. God agrees and Abraham gradually lowers the number, asking if God would spare the city for the sake of 45, 40, 30, 20, and finally, 10 righteous people. God agrees each time. In Genesis chapter 19, the two angels arrive in Sodom and are welcomed by Lot, who offers them hospitality. However, the wicked men of the city surround Lot's house, demanding that he bring out the visitors so that they may have sexual relations with them. Lot, realizing the gravity of the situation, offers his own daughters to the men instead, which is a troubling and morally complex decision. In Genesis chapter 19 verse 20, Lot is speaking to the angels after they have informed him that they will destroy the city of Sodom. Lot pleads with the angels, expressing his desire to flee to a nearby small city, Zoar. He refers to Zoar as a little one, and asks for permission to escape there. He believes that Zoar is small enough to be spared from destruction and requests that his life be spared as well. This verse showcases Lot's desperation and concern for his own life. It also highlights the fact that Lot saw Zoar as a place of refuge and safety amidst the imminent destruction of Sodom. It is important to note that while Lot's concern for his own safety is understandable, his decision to offer his daughters to the wicked men of Sodom earlier in the chapter raises ethical questions. Overall, Genesis chapter 19 verse 20 provides a glimpse into the mindset of Lot and the unfolding events leading up to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. It reminds us of the consequences of sin and the importance of seeking refuge in God's mercy and grace. Genesis chapter 19 verse 21. And he said unto him, See, I have accepted thee concerning this thing also, that I will not overthrow this city, for the which thou hast spoken. This verse is part of the narrative of the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. To understand the context of Genesis chapter 19 verse 21, we need to look at the preceding verses. In Genesis chapter 18, the Lord appeared to Abraham in the form of 3 men and informed him about the impending destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah due to their great wickedness. Abraham, concerned for his nephew Lot who lived in Sodom, interceded on behalf of the righteous people who might be living there. He began to negotiate with God, asking if he would spare the cities if a certain number of righteous people were found within them. Abraham's intercession led to a series of dialogues and requests for mercy. In Genesis chapter 19, the two angels sent by God arrived in Sodom and were welcomed into Lot's house. The wickedness of the city became evident as the men of Sodom surrounded Lot's house, demanding that the visitors be brought out to them. Lot, seeking to protect his guests, offered his 2 virgin daughters to the crowd instead, but the men were determined to commit wicked acts. In the midst of this chaos, the angels reached out and pulled Lot inside the house, then struck the men outside with blindness. They warned Lot about the impending destruction and instructed him to gather his family and leave the city. However, Lot hesitated, causing the angels to seize his hand and those of his wife and daughters, leading them out of the city, urging them to flee for their lives, and not to look back. In verse 21, as Lot expressed his concerns to the angel about the difficulty of escaping to the mountains, he requested a small city named Zoar as a place of refuge instead. The angel granted his request and assured him, saying, "See, I have accepted thee concerning this thing also, that I will not overthrow this city, for the which thou hast spoken." This verse highlights the mercy and compassion of God, even in the midst of judgment. Despite the widespread wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah, God was willing to spare Zoar, a smaller city, because of Lot's plea. It shows that God is open to hearing the requests and concerns of his people and can show mercy based on their intercession. It is important to note that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah ultimately occurred, as described in the subsequent verses. However, this verse specifically addresses Lot's plea and the response he received. Genesis chapter 19 verse 21 teaches us several lessons. First, it reminds us of the gravity of sin and the consequences it can bring. Sodom and Gomorrah were centers of wickedness, and their destruction serves as a warning about the consequences of unrepentant sin. Second, it reveals God's willingness to listen to the prayers and requests of his people. Abraham's intercession and Lot's plea demonstrate that God is compassionate and open to dialogue, even when judgment is imminent. Finally, it emphasizes the importance of righteous individuals and their influence. Lot, though flawed, was considered righteous in God's eyes, 2 Peter chapter 2 verses 7 through 8. His presence in Sodom played a role in God's decision to spare Zoar. This highlights the significance of godly people living amidst a corrupt society and their potential impact on those around them. In summary, Genesis chapter 19 verse 21 illustrates God's mercy and willingness to respond to the intercession and requests of his people. It also emphasizes the consequences of sin and Genesis chapter 19 verse 22. Haste thee, escape thither, for I cannot do anything till thou be come thither. The angel assures Lot that he will not bring about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah until Lot reaches the safety of Zoar. Therefore, the name of the city was called Zoar. In this verse, we find Lot, the nephew of Abraham, who had been residing in the city of Sodom. The previous verses describe the impending destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah due to their great wickedness. However, God had shown mercy to Lot and his family by sending 2 angels to rescue them from the destruction. In Genesis chapter 19 verse 17, the angels urged Lot and his family to escape from the city and flee to the mountains for safety. However, Lot pleaded with him, fearing that the journey would be too difficult. Instead, he requested to flee to a nearby city called Zoar. This is where Genesis chapter 19 verse 22 comes into play. The verse begins with the angel speaking to Lot, saying, "Haste thee, escape thither, for I cannot do anything till thou be come thither." The angel assures Lot that he will not bring about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah until Lot reaches the safety of Zoar. This emphasizes God's mercy and patience, giving Lot and his family time to escape the impending judgment. The second part of the verse explains the significance of the name of the city Zoar. It states, "Therefore the name of the city was called Zoar." The name Zoar means small or insignificant. It suggests that the city received its name because it was a small and insignificant place compared to the great cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. God allowed Lot to find refuge in this lesser-known city as a testament to His grace and deliverance. This verse highlights God's willingness to spare the righteous and provide an escape from His judgment. It also demonstrates His patience in waiting for Lot to reach Zoar before executing His judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah. It serves as a reminder of God's faithfulness and His commitment to protect and deliver those who trust in Him. Overall, Genesis chapter 19 verse 22 teaches us the importance of heeding God's warnings and seeking His guidance. It encourages us to trust in God's provision and to be aware of the consequences of our choices, as seen in the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. Genesis chapter 19 verse 23. The sun was risen upon the earth when Lot entered into Zoar. Genesis chapter 19 verse 23 is part of the narrative of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. In this verse, we see that the sun had risen upon the earth as Lot entered into the city of Zoar. To fully understand the significance of this verse, let's provide some context. In Genesis chapter 19, we read about the account of two cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, which were known for their wickedness and corruption. The Lord had determined to destroy these cities because of their extreme sinfulness. However, due to the intercession of Abraham, God sent two angels to rescue Lot and his family before the destruction. Earlier in the chapter, we find that Lot hesitated to leave the city. The angels warned him of the impending judgment and urged him to flee to the mountains. But Lot requested to be allowed to go to a nearby city called Zoar instead. The angels granted his request and told him to hurry to Zoar because they could not do anything until he arrived there, as seen in Genesis chapter 19 verses 21 through 22. Genesis chapter 19 verse 23 records that as Lot entered into Zoar, the sun had risen upon the earth. This detail seems to indicate the timing of events in the narrative. It suggests that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah occurred after Lot's arrival in Zoar. The rising of the sun serves as a visual indicator of a new day beginning. It could also symbolize a turning point in the story, as Lot and his family had been rescued and taken to safety. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah would happen shortly after, but Lot and his family were protected from it. This verse also emphasizes God's sovereignty over nature. The rising of the sun, a natural phenomenon, coincides with the fulfillment of God's judgment upon the wicked cities. It shows that God's timing and actions are not subject to human control but are governed by His divine plan. In summary, Genesis chapter 19 verse 23 highlights the timing of events in the account of Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction. It signifies the dawn of a new day and foreshadows the imminent judgment upon the wicked cities. It also demonstrates God's control over nature and His faithfulness in rescuing Lot and his family before executing His judgment. Genesis chapter 19 verse 24. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. This verse is part of the account of the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, found in Genesis chapter 19. Let's explore the context and significance of this verse within the broader biblical narrative. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah begins in Genesis chapter 18 when the Lord appeared to Abraham in the form of three men. The Lord informed Abraham that He intended to investigate the wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham interceded on behalf of any righteous people who might be found there, asking if the Lord would spare the cities if 50 righteous people were present. The Lord agreed, and Abraham's intercession continued as he asked if the Lord would spare the cities for the sake of fewer righteous people, eventually reaching a minimum of 10. In Genesis chapter 19, the two angels who had accompanied the Lord arrive in Sodom and are welcomed into Lot's house. However, the wicked men of the city surround Lot's house and demand to have sexual relations with the two visitors. Lot, who was righteous and hospitable, offers his daughters instead, but the men persist. The angels intervene, striking the wicked men with blindness and urging Lot and his family to flee the city because the Lord had determined to destroy it. As Lot and his family fled the city, the Lord rained down brimstone and fire upon Sodom and Gomorrah. The destruction was swift and complete, reducing the cities and their inhabitants to ruins. Lot's wife, who looked back as they fled, was turned into a pillar of salt as a consequence of her disobedience. The significance of Genesis chapter 19 verse 24 lies in the judgment and destruction executed by God upon Sodom and Gomorrah. This event serves as a powerful example of God's righteous judgment against wickedness and rebellion. It highlights the consequences of sin and the importance of living in accordance with God's commands. Throughout the Bible, Sodom and Gomorrah are often referenced as examples of extreme wickedness and moral corruption. The destruction of these cities is also mentioned in the New Testament by Jesus himself, emphasizing the consequences of unrepentant sin, in Luke chapter 17 verses 28 through 30. The passage underscores God's justice and his intolerance for unrepentant sin. It also serves as a warning and a reminder that the Lord is the ultimate judge, with the power to bring both mercy and judgment upon humanity. In summary, Genesis chapter 19 verse 24 depicts the devastating destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah as a consequence of their extreme wickedness. The verse serves as a powerful reminder of God's righteous judgment and his intolerance for unrepentant sin. Genesis chapter 19 verse 25. And he overthrew those cities, and all the plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground. This verse is part of the account of the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. To fully understand this verse, it is necessary to provide some context from the preceding verses. In Genesis chapter 19, 2 angels arrived in the city of Sodom, where Abraham's nephew Lot lived with his family. These angels came to rescue Lot and his family before God's judgment fell upon the wicked cities. Lot welcomed the angels into his house and offered them hospitality. However, the men of the city, both young and old, surrounded Lot's house and demanded that the angels be brought out so that they could engage in immoral acts with them. Lot, seeking to protect his guests, offered his own daughters to the crowd instead, which reveals the moral degradation of the city at that time. The angels struck the crowd with blindness, saving Lot and his family. The angels then warned Lot and his family to flee from the city because God had determined to destroy it. They were told to escape to the mountains and not look back. Lot hesitated initially but was urged to hurry. As they fled, God rained down brimstone and fire upon the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, utterly destroying them and the surrounding plain. Now, let's focus on Genesis chapter 19 verse 25 itself. This verse highlights the extent of God's judgment. It states that God overthrew those cities, including all the inhabitants and everything that grew upon the ground. This emphasizes the comprehensive nature of the destruction. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah serves as a powerful example of God's judgment against sin and wickedness. The cities had become consumed with immorality, including homosexuality, which is referenced in the earlier verses. God, being a just and righteous God, could not allow such wickedness to continue unchecked. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah serves as a reminder of God's holiness and his intolerance for sin. This event is also mentioned in the New Testament, particularly in the teachings of Jesus. Jesus referred to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah as a warning to those who reject the message of the gospel and continue in sin, Luke chapter 17 verses 28 through 30. It serves as a reminder that God will one day judge the world, and it underscores the importance of repentance and turning away from sin. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 19 verse 25 records the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, emphasizing the comprehensive nature of God's judgment upon these cities and their inhabitants. This event serves as a warning against immorality and wickedness and highlights God's righteous judgment. It also reminds us of the need for repentance and turning away from sin in light of God's coming judgment. Genesis chapter 19 verse 26. But his wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. This verse is a part of the narrative of the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. It tells the story of Lot and his family who were living in Sodom. Angels had come to rescue Lot and his family before the cities were destroyed by God's judgment due to their extreme wickedness. In Genesis chapter 19 verses 15 through 16, the angels urged Lot and his family to leave the city, warning him not to look back and to flee to the mountains for their safety. However, as Lot and his family were fleeing, Lot's wife turned back and looked at the city, and as a consequence, she was turned into a pillar of salt. This incident serves as a warning about the importance of obedience and trust in God. Lot's wife's disobedience and attachment to the city of Sodom led to her tragic end. It is crucial to understand that her act of looking back was not simply a glance or a mere curiosity but demonstrated a longing and nostalgia for the sinful and wicked lifestyle she had left behind. By disobeying God's command, she showed a lack of faith and a failure to fully sever her ties to the sinful city. The transformation of Lot's wife into a pillar of salt is a visible demonstration of God's judgment and the consequences of disobedience. It serves as a reminder that God's commands are to be taken seriously and obeyed faithfully. It also highlights the importance of focusing on God's will and direction for our lives rather than being attached to worldly possessions or sinful ways. This passage is often interpreted as a cautionary tale about the dangers of looking back longingly at past sinful or worldly lifestyles. It teaches believers the importance of fully committing to a life of faith, leaving behind the things that hinder their spiritual growth, and trusting in God's guidance for the future. It is worth noting that the Bible does not provide further details or explanations regarding the transformation of Lot's wife into a pillar of salt. The focus of the story is primarily on the judgment of God and the consequences of disobedience rather than providing a scientific or physiological explanation for the event. Overall, Genesis chapter 19 verse 26 serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of obedience, trust, and wholehearted commitment to God, urging believers to look forward and focus on the path of righteousness rather than being enticed by the allure of sin and worldly pursuits. Genesis chapter 19 verse 27. And Abraham got up early in the morning to the place where he stood before the Lord. This verse occurs in the context of the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Prior to this verse, we read about the Lord's decision to destroy the cities due to their great wickedness, and how Abraham interceded on behalf of his nephew Lot and his family. Morning devotion. The verse begins by stating that Abraham got up early in the morning. This phrase indicates Abraham's eagerness and diligence in seeking the Lord's presence. Getting up early in the morning suggests a desire for communion with God and a willingness to prioritize his relationship with the Lord above all else. Abraham's actions serve as a reminder for us to start our days by seeking God, dedicating time for prayer, meditation, and reading of His Word. A familiar place. Abraham goes to the place where he stood before the Lord. This indicates that there was a specific location where Abraham had previously encountered God or worshipped Him. It could have been a place where Abraham had built an altar or a designated spot where he sought the Lord's guidance and presence. The fact that Abraham returns to this specific place suggests a sense of familiarity, reverence, and the recognition that it was a holy place where he had experienced a connection with God. Consistency in worship. Abraham's action of returning to the place where he previously stood before the Lord reveals his consistency and commitment to worship. It highlights the importance of establishing regular patterns of worship and seeking God's presence in our lives. Consistency in our devotion and worship helps cultivate a deeper relationship with God and allows us to experience His presence more intimately. Reflection and preparation. Abraham's decision to return to the place where he encountered God could also signify a time of reflection and preparation. He may have gone there to seek further guidance, pray for God's protection over Lot and his family, or seek understanding about the upcoming events. In our own lives, it is crucial to take time to reflect on our experiences, seek God's guidance, and prepare ourselves spiritually for the challenges we may face. Overall, Genesis chapter 19 verse 27 teaches us the importance of prioritizing our relationship with God, seeking Him diligently, establishing consistent patterns of worship, and taking time for reflection and preparation in His presence. It encourages us to start our days by seeking God's presence, recognizing the significance of specific places where we have encountered Him before, and allowing Him to guide us in our journey of faith. Genesis chapter 19 verse 28. And he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward all the land of the plain, and beheld, and, lo, the smoke of the country went up as the smoke of a furnace. Genesis chapter 19 verse 28 is part of the account of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. To understand the context, we need to review the events leading up to this verse. In Genesis chapter 18, the Lord appeared to Abraham and informed him of his plan to investigate the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah due to their great wickedness. Abraham interceded on behalf of the righteous people living there, and the Lord agreed to spare the cities if even 10 righteous individuals were found. In Genesis chapter 19, 2 angels arrived in Sodom and were welcomed into the house of Abraham's nephew, Lot. The men of the city, both young and old, surrounded Lot's house and demanded that the angels be brought out to them so that they could engage in sexual immorality with them. Recognizing the grave sinfulness of the crowd, Lot went out to address them and offered his virgin daughters instead. However, the men persisted in their wickedness. As dawn approached, the angels urged Lot to gather his family and leave the city, for the Lord was about to destroy it. Though hesitant, Lot and his family were escorted out of the city by the angels. They were instructed not to look back but to flee to the mountains for safety. Lot, fearing the mountains, pleaded with the angels to allow him to escape to a small city called Zoar. The Lord granted his request and spared Zoar from destruction. Verse 28 marks the moment when Abraham's perspective extends beyond the fleeing Lot and his family. As he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding plain, he witnessed a horrifying sight. The smoke rising from the land resembled that of a furnace. This image symbolizes the complete devastation and obliteration of the cities due to their sinful behavior. Genesis chapter 19 verse 28 serves as a powerful reminder of the consequences of unrepentant wickedness. Sodom and Gomorrah had reached a level of moral degradation and depravity that ultimately led to their destruction. It highlights the righteousness of God and his commitment to judge and punish evil. This passage also demonstrates the importance of righteousness and the power of intercession. Although Lot and his family were rescued due to Abraham's intercession, the cities themselves were beyond redemption. It emphasizes the necessity of living in accordance with God's will and seeking righteousness rather than indulging in sinful practices. In summary, Genesis chapter 19 verse 28 depicts the aftermath of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, displaying the severe consequences of unrepentant wickedness. It serves as a solemn reminder of God's justice and the importance of living righteously in his sight. Genesis chapter 19 verse 29. And it came to pass, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham, and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in the which Lot dwelt. Genesis chapter 19 tells the account of the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and the rescue of Lot, the nephew of Abraham, by 2 angels. Lot had been living in Sodom, a city known for its wickedness and depravity. In this verse, we see that God remembered Abraham. This phrase indicates that God's promise to Abraham was still in effect. Earlier in Genesis chapter 18, Abraham had a conversation with God about the impending judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham interceded on behalf of the righteous people living in those cities, particularly his nephew Lot. He pleaded with God, asking if he would spare the cities if there were even just 50 righteous people. Through a series of negotiations, Abraham managed to reduce the number to 10. However, when the angels arrived in Sodom, they found only Lot and his family to be righteous, and thus the city was condemned. God's remembrance of Abraham and his faithfulness to his promise is evident in his actions toward Lot. Despite the wickedness surrounding Lot, God extended his mercy and grace to him. The verse states that God sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow. God delivered Lot and his family from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. This verse highlights God's sovereignty and his ability to rescue and protect his people in the midst of judgment. It also emphasizes the significance of intercession and the power of a righteous person's prayers. Abraham's intercession played a role in God's decision to rescue Lot. Moreover, this passage serves as a reminder of the consequences of wickedness and the righteousness of God's judgment. Sodom and Gomorrah were cities consumed by sin, and God's destruction of these cities serves as a warning about the consequences of living in rebellion against God's ways. In summary, Genesis chapter 19 verse 29 demonstrates God's faithfulness to His promises and His ability to deliver His people. It also emphasizes the importance of intercession and highlights the consequences of wickedness. Genesis chapter 19 verse 30. And Lot went up out of Zoar, and dwelt in the mountain, and his 2 daughters with him. For he feared to dwell in Zoar, and he dwelt in a cave, he and his 2 daughters. This verse is part of the narrative following the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. In this passage, we see Lot, the nephew of Abraham, leaving the city of Zoar and seeking refuge in the mountains. It's important to provide some context to understand the significance of this event and its implications. Earlier in Genesis chapter 19, we read about the angelic visitors who arrived at Sodom to deliver a message to Lot and to warn him of the impending destruction. They instructed Lot and his family to flee the city and not to look back. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by God's judgment due to their great wickedness and immorality. After the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot and his 2 daughters settled in Zoar, which was spared from destruction. However, Lot feared for his safety in Zoar and decided to move to the mountains. Lot's decision to dwell in a cave with his 2 daughters highlights the desperate and isolated situation they found themselves in. It is essential to note that the actions of Lot and his daughters in the subsequent verses, Genesis chapter 19 verses 31 through 38, are morally problematic. In a misguided attempt to continue their family line, the daughters engaged in incestuous relations with their father, resulting in pregnancies and the birth of 2 sons. This narrative serves as a cautionary tale, illustrating the consequences of moral compromise and the degradation that can occur when people stray from God's intended design for relationships. Genesis chapter 19 verse 30, within the broader context of the chapter, emphasizes the dire circumstances faced by Lot and his daughters following the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The passage serves as a reminder of the consequences of sin and the importance of remaining faithful to God's commands, even in challenging circumstances. Genesis chapter 19 verse 31. And the firstborn said unto the younger, Our father is old, and there is not a man in the earth to come in unto us after the manner of all the earth. Context: the story of Genesis chapter 19 focuses on the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the rescue of Lot and his daughters. Prior to this verse, Lot and his family were warned by angels to flee the city and not look back. The cities were destroyed, and Lot and his daughters found refuge in a cave. The firstborn daughter speaks. In this verse, the firstborn daughter speaks to her younger sister. Their father, Lot, had become fearful and resided in a cave. The daughters believed that there was no one left on earth to have relations with them in the same way that people normally do. The moral and cultural context: in ancient times, it was crucial for a family to have offspring to carry on the family line. In this verse, the daughters' concern for their family's future lineage reflects this cultural context. Their statement reflects their understanding that their father was too old to bear children and that no other men were available for them to marry. The aftermath: in the following verses, Genesis chapter 19 verses 32 through 38, the daughters devise a plan to have children with their father. They get their father drunk and sleep with him on consecutive nights, each becoming pregnant. The elder daughter gives birth to Moab, the ancestor of the Moabites, while the younger daughter gives birth to Ben-Ammi, the ancestor of the Ammonites. Moral and theological implications: this passage presents a challenging ethical dilemma. While the daughters' intent may have been to ensure the continuation of their family line, their actions of seducing and sleeping with their drunken father are morally questionable. It demonstrates how the loss of faith and the influence of the sinful environment in Sodom and Gomorrah had affected Lot and his family. Lessons for believers: this passage serves as a reminder of the consequences of compromising one's values and faith. It highlights the importance of remaining steadfast in one's beliefs and not succumbing to the pressures of the world. Additionally, It warns against the dangers of becoming entangled in sinful environments and making hasty decisions without seeking God's guidance. God's sovereignty and redemption. Despite the moral complexities presented in this passage, God's redemptive plan is not thwarted. Both Moab and Ammon, born from this questionable union, eventually become nations. God's grace can still work through imperfect circumstances and flawed individuals to accomplish His purposes. Overall, Genesis chapter 19 verse 31 reveals the desperate situation faced by Lot's daughters and the moral and ethical challenges they encountered. It serves as a reminder to believers to maintain faith and seek God's guidance in difficult circumstances. It also demonstrates God's sovereignty and His ability to work through imperfect situations to fulfill His purposes. Genesis chapter 19 verse 32. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve seed of our father. Genesis chapter 19 tells the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the escape of Lot and his daughters. This particular verse refers to an incident that occurs after Lot and his daughters flee from the cities. To understand the context and meaning of Genesis chapter 19 verse 32, we need to review the events leading up to it. Lot and his family were residents of Sodom, a city filled with wickedness. The Lord decided to destroy the city because of its rampant sinfulness, but He showed mercy to Lot and his family. 2 angels were sent to Sodom to rescue Lot before the destruction took place. In Genesis chapter 19 verses 1 through 11, we see that the wicked men of Sodom surrounded Lot's house and demanded that Lot bring out the 2 men, that is, angels, so that they could have sexual relations with them. Lot, recognizing the evil intentions of the men, offers his 2 virgin daughters instead, hoping to protect the visitors. This action is often seen as an example of Lot's flawed judgment and the moral degradation of the city. In verses 12 through 29, the angels instruct Lot and his family to flee from the city before its destruction. They warn him not to look back, but Lot's wife disobeys and becomes a pillar of salt. Lot and his 2 daughters escape to the mountains and find refuge in a cave. It is in this cave that the incident described in Genesis chapter 19 verse 32 occurs. Lot's daughters, thinking that they and their father are the only survivors left on earth, come up with a plan to preserve their family line. They make their father drink wine and engage in sexual relations with him, hoping to conceive and continue their family line. This action is born out of desperation and a lack of understanding of God's plan. This passage raises moral and ethical questions, as it involves incestuous relations between a father and his daughters. It is important to note that the Bible does not condone or endorse such behavior. Rather, it presents the events as they unfolded, providing an honest account of the flaws and mistakes made by individuals. The incident described in Genesis chapter 19 verse 32 serves as a reminder of the consequences of sin and the moral decay that existed in Sodom. It highlights the extent to which people can be influenced by their surroundings and make poor decisions. It also underscores the importance of seeking God's guidance and following His moral principles, even in the face of challenging circumstances. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 19 verse 32 depicts a dark and troubling event involving Lot and his daughters. It serves as a reminder of the destructive consequences of sin and the need for individuals to seek God's wisdom and guidance in all aspects of life. Genesis chapter 19 verse 33, "And they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in, and lay with her father, and he perceived not when she lay down, nor when she arose." This verse is part of the narrative of the account of Lot and his daughters, which follows the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. To understand the context of this verse, it's necessary to examine the events leading up to it. In Genesis chapter 19, 2 angels arrived in Sodom in the evening and were greeted by Lot, who offered them hospitality and urged them to stay at his house. However, the wicked men of the city, upon seeing the angels, surrounded Lot's house and demanded that the visitors be brought out to them so they could have sexual relations with them. Lot, seeking to protect his guests, offered his 2 virgin daughters to the men instead, hoping to redirect their sinful desires. However, The angels intervened and struck the men with blindness. Knowing that God intended to destroy the city of Sodom, the angels urged Lot and his family to flee from the impending judgment. Lot, his wife, and 2 daughters left the city, but Lot's wife looked back and was turned into a pillar of salt. Lot and his daughters sought refuge in a cave in the mountains. In the cave, Lot's daughters became concerned about the future and the possibility of not having offspring. They devised a plan to have children by their father. They made their father, Lot, drink wine on 2 consecutive nights, and each daughter had sexual relations with him without his knowledge. The older daughter went in first, and then the younger daughter followed the next night. The specific verse in question, Genesis chapter 19 verse 33, describes the act of the firstborn daughter having sexual relations with Lot while he was under the influence of wine. It emphasizes that Lot was unaware of what happened, both when the daughter lay down and when she arose. The account continues in the following verses, stating that both daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter gave birth to a son named Moab, who would become the ancestor of the Moabites. The younger daughter gave birth to a son named Ben-Ammi, who would become the ancestor of the Ammonites. This passage presents a morally challenging situation, and it raises questions about the actions of Lot and his daughters. The Bible does not provide a clear endorsement of their behavior but rather records it as a historical event. It is essential to understand that this account describes a time before the Mosaic Law, in a society and culture that had significant moral decay. It is worth noting that this passage does not excuse or justify incest or any form of sexual immorality. The Bible consistently condemns such behavior in other parts of Scripture. The inclusion of this account serves to highlight the consequences of the moral degradation of Sodom and Gomorrah, as well as to illustrate the flawed actions of individuals in desperate circumstances. Overall, this passage serves as a reminder of the consequences of sin and the need for moral righteousness. It also showcases the brokenness of humanity and the reality that even those considered righteous, like Lot, can make grave mistakes. Genesis chapter 19 verse 34. And it came to pass on the morrow, that the firstborn said unto the younger, Behold, I lay yesternight with my father. Let us make him drink wine this night also, and go thou in, and lie with him, that we may preserve seed of our father. Genesis chapter 19 tells the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the rescue of Lot and his family. This particular verse focuses on an incident involving Lot's daughters after they had fled from the city and sought refuge in a cave in the mountains. To understand the context of this verse, it's essential to examine the events leading up to it. In Genesis chapter 19 verses 30 to 33, we learn that Lot and his 2 daughters had settled in a cave. They believed that they were the only survivors of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The daughters, out of concern for their father's lineage and the continuation of their family, devised a plan to ensure they could bear children. In verse 34, the firstborn daughter says to the younger daughter, Behold, I lay yesternight with my father. Let us make him drink wine this night also, and go thou in, and lie with him, that we may preserve seed of our father. Their plan was to get their father drunk and have sexual relations with him so that they could conceive and carry on the family line. Upon first reading, this verse can be perplexing and troubling, as it describes incestuous behavior. It is crucial to note that the Bible does not endorse or condone such actions. Rather, it records events as they happened, revealing the flawed nature of humanity. The story of Lot and his daughters is a narrative that highlights the moral degradation of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, as well as the consequences of living in a society steeped in wickedness. The passage serves as a reminder of the gravity of sin and the depths to which people can sink when they turn away from God's ways. It demonstrates the devastating effects of living in a culture corrupted by immorality and the need for redemption and righteousness. It is important to approach this verse with caution and recognize that it depicts an unfortunate incident in human history. Christians should not interpret it as an endorsement or approval of incestuous relationships. Instead, it is a reminder of the brokenness and fallenness of humanity and the need for God's grace and transformation in our lives. As we continue to study the Bible, it is crucial to consider the broader teachings and principles found within its pages. The Bible provides guidance, wisdom, and moral instruction, and it is essential to interpret specific verses within the context of the overall message of Scripture. Genesis chapter 19 verse 35. And they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in, and lay with her father, and he perceived not when she lay down, nor when she arose. This verse is part of the account of Lot and his daughters after they fled from the city of Sodom, which was about to be destroyed by God because of its wickedness. Lot's wife had turned into a pillar of salt as a result of looking back at the city against God's command. After leaving the city, Lot and his daughters took refuge in a cave in the mountains. Feeling that they were the only survivors and fearing that they would not have descendants, the daughters devised a plan to have children by their father. They got their father drunk with wine on 2 consecutive nights and had sexual relations with him, resulting in both daughters becoming pregnant. This particular verse describes the firstborn daughter's actions. It mentions that they made their father drink wine and that she went in and lay with him. It also notes that Lot was unaware of what had transpired, indicating that he was too intoxicated to realize what was happening. It is important to note that the Bible does not endorse or approve of the actions taken by Lot's daughters. In fact, their behavior is condemned as sinful and incestuous. The story serves as a sobering reminder of the consequences of sin and the depths to which human depravity can sink. While this account raises challenging moral questions, it is essential to interpret it within the broader context of the Bible. The Bible records both the triumphs and failures of its characters, and it does not shy away from depicting the consequences of their actions. It emphasizes the need for repentance and the importance of following God's commands. Ultimately, this episode in Genesis highlights the fallen nature of humanity and serves as a reminder of our need for God's grace and redemption. It demonstrates the consequences of straying from God's plan and serves as a cautionary tale against succumbing to sin and its destructive effects. Genesis chapter 19 verse 36. And the 2 daughters of Lot, which were with child by their father. This verse is part of the account of the events that took place after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot and his 2 daughters fled from the cities as God rained down fire and brimstone upon them. They sought refuge in a cave in the mountains. In the previous verses, Genesis chapter 19 verses 30 through 35, Lot and his daughters found themselves without a husband or any potential suitors. Feeling desperate and fearing they would never have children, the daughters devised a plan to ensure their family line would continue. They got their father drunk on 2 consecutive nights and each lay with him, becoming pregnant as a result. The verse in question, Genesis chapter 19 verse 36, simply states that the 2 daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. It is essential to understand that the Bible records historical events and does not necessarily endorse or condone everything it describes. This account serves as a cautionary tale and highlights the consequences of the immoral and sinful actions committed by the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. It demonstrates the degradation and moral decline that occurred in those cities and reveals the effects of sin on individuals and families. This passage also serves as a reminder of the importance of righteous living and the consequences of straying from God's commands. Lot's family faced dire circumstances as a result of their choices and the influence of the corrupt society they lived in. It underscores the need for individuals to seek God's guidance, to resist temptation, and to make choices that align with His will. In studying this verse, it is crucial to consider the broader context of the story and the themes it conveys. While the actions described in this passage are troubling, they reveal the fallen nature of humanity and the need for redemption. The Bible consistently presents flawed individuals and their stories as a means of teaching moral lessons and illustrating the power of God's grace and forgiveness. Genesis chapter 19 verse 37. And the firstborn bare a son, and called his name Moab. The same is the father of the Moabites unto this day. This verse is part of the account of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. In the preceding verses, Lot, the nephew of Abraham, escaped the destruction along with his 2 daughters. They settled in a cave in the mountains, fearing to stay in the nearby city of Zoar. In Genesis chapter 19 verse 37, it is mentioned that Lot's older daughter gave birth to a son and named him Moab. The verse further explains that Moab became the father of the Moabite people. The Moabites were an ancient people who lived in the region east of the Dead Sea, in what is now modern-day Jordan. This verse provides insight into the origin of the Moabite people. According to biblical genealogy, they were descendants of Lot, who was Abraham's nephew. The Moabites are often mentioned throughout the Old Testament as a neighboring people to the Israelites. They had a complex relationship with the Israelites, sometimes being allies and at other times adversaries. The naming of Moab can be seen as significant. In Hebrew, Moab sounds similar to the phrase, "from my father." It is believed that Lot's older daughter named him Moab because he was conceived in an unusual circumstance. After the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, when they believed there were no men left to give them children, the daughters resorted to an act of incest with their father, Lot, resulting in their pregnancies. This account raises moral and ethical questions, as the actions of Lot and his daughters can be seen as highly problematic. The Bible records events, both positive and negative, and the actions of its characters do not always reflect divine approval or moral righteousness. Instead, it presents a historical account of humanity, showing the flaws and mistakes of individuals and their consequences. In summary, Genesis chapter 19 verse 37 explains the origin of the Moabite people, tracing their lineage back to Lot's firstborn son, Moab. This verse highlights the complex relationships and moral challenges faced by the characters in the biblical narrative while providing historical context for the Moabites' presence in the Old Testament. Genesis chapter 19 verse 38. And the younger, she also bare a son, and called his name Ben-ammi, the same is the father of the children of Ammon unto this day. Context: Genesis chapter 19 recounts the narrative of the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. The wickedness of these cities had become great in the sight of God, and he sent 2 angels to rescue Lot and his family before the cities were destroyed by fire and brimstone. The angels warned Lot and his family not to look back as they fled the cities, but Lot's wife disobeyed and was turned into a pillar of salt. Lot's daughter's actions: after escaping the doomed city, Lot and his daughters settled in a cave in the mountains. Fearful that they were the only survivors left on earth, Lot's daughters devised a plan to preserve their father's lineage. They got Lot drunk on wine on 2 consecutive nights and each had sexual relations with him without his knowledge. As a result, both daughters became pregnant. Ben-ammi's birth: Genesis chapter 19 verse 38 specifically mentions the younger daughter giving birth to a son whom she named Ben-ammi. The name Ben-ammi means son of my people, or son of my kin. The verse further explains that Ben-ammi became the father of the Ammonites, an ancient people who inhabited the region east of the Jordan River, near modern-day Jordan. Lessons and reflections: the story of Lot and his daughters in Genesis chapter 19 verse 38 is a complex and morally problematic account. It reveals the consequences of a family's actions and highlights the dangers of making decisions based on fear and desperation. It also demonstrates the far-reaching effects of those choices, as the offspring of this union became the progenitors of the Ammonite people. From a theological perspective, this passage reminds us of the fallen nature of humanity and the consequences of sin. It also serves as a reminder of God's grace and His ability to work through flawed individuals to accomplish His purposes. However, it is important to note that the Bible does not endorse or condone the actions of Lot's daughters in this passage. Rather, it presents these events as historical facts without explicit moral commentary. The Bible does not shy away from depicting the failures and shortcomings of its characters, presenting them as flawed individuals in need of God's redemption and forgiveness. As with any passage in the Bible, it is crucial to consider the broader context and the message conveyed by the entirety of Scripture when seeking understanding and application.